Hello and welcome to Future Thinking with Stylus. I'm your host, Christian Ward, Head of Brand Engagement and Multimedia Strategy at Stylus. In this episode, we're going to be discussing responses to Black Lives Matter from brands and the media and explore what systemic change needs to happen across the board. To discuss this, I'm joined by Ernest Owens, journalist and writer at large for Philadelphia Magazine, who recently landed on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, and Amber Davis, previously advisory strategist at Stylus, but who has left us sadly for greater things at Vox Media, where she is now Director of Creative Strategy. Welcome to you both. So Ernest, I'd like to start with you. I was reading a recent piece from you in Philly Mag where you talk about ally culture and how it's a, in your words, vapid solution to the problem of systemic racism. And a lot of the people listening to this will be working in brands who may have signaled support for Black Lives Matter in small ways or big ways, but most will probably fall under that banner of allyship. So why do you think it's not enough, and what sort of action should they be focusing on instead?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. For many years, I mean, even dating back to 2015, there has been many variations of people critiquing, do allies even exist? Several Black activists that have been on the ground in places like Ferguson and beyond, even Black women activists such as Feminista Jones and others have been speaking about this question around allies. And so my sentiments have followed a wave of others before me. And as I continue to think about the conversation even now, this role of people, white people specifically, performing this in-service concept of, being in support. And what does that even mean? There's been a lot of people who've kind of embraced the term and kind of have self-designated themselves as allies and people who are, against racial injustice. But, there has been many others, including myself, who've been a little critical about that. Like, what does that mean when you self-designate yourself the solution to the problem that you basically have perpetuated? Racism is a white person's problem. It's something that they have systemically and socially benefited from. And, to now put yourself in the role of saying you're going to be the fixer and the savior of such, it's really complicated, especially as a Black queer person who hear people call themselves allies in the LGBTQ community as cishet people. And then you have people who are in the Black community that are, who are white people who say in these spaces that they are allies to Black issues. And, for me, I wonder, what does it look like in a world where white people are the problem, but then also want to be the hero and villain in the story against racial injustice? And that is something that I personally have wrestled with in my mind when people use the term allies.
Amber, obviously, brands want to do something. I mean, the opposite of allyship isn't silence, is it? It's actually, making a proper, change within and making proper positive impact without. Are there things that can be done that go beyond mere allyship, or what have you seen?
I would say there are definitely things that have to be done. I think if people stop thinking of themselves, both individuals and brands, as allies and more as like co-conspirators, people who are also putting themselves on the line versus standing by and saying they are in support of. I think we saw in a lot of the reactions to the Black background, white text statements that have been put out over the last few weeks from companies that neither have the standing nor the record to really lay claim to any kind of solidarity. And some of the reactions to that have been instructive. If you're someone who's watching what companies do, people have basically stood up and said, okay, but why are you treating your workers like this? What are you doing about environmental racism? Peloton, where are your products being manufactured? Are they being manufactured in areas where there's off-gassing that's contributing to environmental racism? It's sort of like they have popped their heads up and been met with a lot of critiques that they can either take in and use to make change, do something. That's the aspect of anything that you would call allyship that is meaningful, and anything else is just lip service. It's sort of like calling attention to oneself in order to get a certain amount of kudos in a moment, and then hoping that people will forget about the other things that you may be doing or have done that are not contributory. So it's quite easy to speak out of both sides of your mouth, but it's really important that you don't behave like a miner that has a Superfund site and thinks that they've solved the problem by organizing a beach cleanup. That there's a certain amount of scale and kind of self-analysis that needs to come along with any kind of statement of solidarity. Otherwise, it's not just empty, it's hostile.
Well, that's an interesting point there at the end, but where you talk about, where you say hostile, because I mean, what's been interesting for this moment to happen while all of us are locked down and perhaps more online than we normally would be, is that the scrutiny that everyone's coming under from a perspective of what the response might be is very strong, because everybody is, spending a lot of time reading about this, thinking about it, talking about it. I guess the typical, I mean, there are typical responses from brands to this kind of thing. We saw it the first time round with Ferguson. There were again brand responses. This time round, you're not going to be able to just, as you say, do something basic, because all eyes are on you. Would you say that's correct?
I mean, I hope so. I think that COVID was definitely, it served as like a primer for what could follow you making any kind of declarations of being with someone. So a company like Walmart standing up and saying, we support our employees, we're here for them, we're doing everything to make things safe. And then very quickly finding people on Twitter talking about how a Walmart worker was spit on, or they're not being protected at the cashier level, or they're not being provided with PPE. It's sort of like there was already a system and a number of people who were, because they were idle or they're always invested in kind of labor issues, were ready to look and kind of check the work of the companies that are making these claims. One thing I will say is that companies that have had this pushback, there's been less immediately defense and a little bit more self-analysis than before. And I think like that gives me a certain amount of hope. But I think that ultimately it will be activists and policymakers holding their feet to the fire that makes a difference, and not anything that comes from within, unless it's baked into their values. Not everyone is Ben and Jerry's. Not everyone has this baked into their values.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, Ernest, again, in one of your pieces, you mention Reddit's Alexis Ohanian's response. And obviously Reddit is it doesn't have those values baked into it, shall we say. Nonetheless, that was something you called out as a more meaningful response than other brands have been giving. I mean, have you seen anything else that sort of chimes in that way with you, or is that still an outlier?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, the all of the black boxes and all this allyship performative stuff is really not addressing racism, essentially. I mean, these are all awareness campaigns, but really racism is about power and dismantling power. And when you say the word white supremacy, the word supreme is in that word supremacist, which means white power, which means that if you're trying to combat white supremacy, you're trying to combat white power in various forms. And so when you are a white person that occupy a lot of power institutionally, systemically, and socially and politically, the only way that you're going to really address racism is if you redistribute that power to the marginalized Black and brown people and indigenous people that bear claim to it, rightfully so. And so what happened at Reddit of a white man stepping down and requiring and recommending that a Black person, which they did find the replacement, take that seat, that is an example of redistributing power, stepping down. And not only that, but he is using his stock and his money to go towards Black causes as well. Those are examples. But another example is really at home. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the editor of Philadelphia Magazine, the place that I contribute to in Philadelphia, Tom McGrath, who is the current editor there, he just recently resigned. And last day is going to actually be towards the end of the summer. And pretty much said that at this point he stepped down because of reading the piece that I wrote, had him thinking about it, which is interesting. But also too recognizing that, pretty much his work as an older white straight guy is just not enough. And he's pretty much said that he recommended in his memo that, the next person that takes his seat is someone who is not a white old straight man. And so that volunteering, that stepping up, not being forced out, right? Because that's what happened at the Philadelphia Inquirer. That happened at other publications where people were forced out, but taking yourself out, not having to do so based on being forced or being shamed into doing it, but simply saying, in order to make the change necessary, I, as a white person, have to take myself out the equation in these positions of real power. So I think that was another example that, is a personal one that I just witnessed. And listening to Black people and listening to other Black and brown voices, I think that is the kind of, co-conspiratorship that I think white people need to model after, because too busy, they want to be front and center in a movement that isn't about them. They want to be still wagging, I think Bernice King was talking about this, but saying a seat, let's give more Black people a seat at our table. She discussed on a tweet that pretty much implies the white power is still there. So if you're able to dictate how many Black people can sit there and be a part of it, then you'll recognize that everyone else's, that power is only inviting people rather than dismantling. And so companies and brands have to be mindful about how they are in their own institutions doing more than just talking, like Amber said, and giving lip service, but how they are creating a structural change. And that's going to take more work than just a social media post or a public statement. It's going to take more work.
Amber, these conversations going on at Vox Media. I mean, you are.
Yeah.
Is it what kind of environment is it in terms of seeking this structural change?
There's definitely a lot of awareness of like the whiteness of the executive team. And a lot of conversations, as a lot of the stepping aside has happened in media. So much of it has happened in media, some voluntarily, some not so much. That when we're talking about, when internally there have been conversations about kind of voices and who's in the room, it's always like, let's make the room bigger versus like, let's keep the room the same size, but maybe there are some people who should step out. A podcast that I've been listening to since its inception in like 2006 finally had a conversation about like, let's consider that we are 3 white people sitting around a table talking about the entirety of politics in the United States. This is the Slate Political Gabfest, and whether or not it should be so. It's like we bring people on, but like who would step out? Like who would we swap out? And it is, as Ernest said, like the making room for people, that is when in some cases you run up against a wall, because it's very easy to talk about empowerment when it doesn't mean you giving up any power, and like making room and hearing other voices when you still get to talk. And there are lots of cases where the best thing to do is to like give yourself the boot and do something else and let someone else take over, because you may have an understanding that you are not the person to solve this particular problem because you made it, you institutionalized it, you've supported it, and perhaps it's time for a fresh start. I will say Vox has been very self-critical, and also there's been a lot of sharing of articles that were written on different parts of Vox to remind people of kind of like a thing they may be doing or a thing they should be thinking about. So it's kind of interesting when you can use the work of your colleagues to make a point you don't want to be bothered to make. But in media in general, obviously there's been a lot of attention there. But the thought of like Anna Wintour having some sort of revelation that she had no idea and now everything has changed, it's just very difficult to believe. And I think everyone should be quite skeptical of that, considering the number of people that have been trying to have these conversations. But I'm optimistic that the fact that people are stepping aside is we're seeing another solution to the problem or getting towards the problem. And that is for some people to like give room to someone else.
And does that impetus have to come from them, do you think, or is that something that you know, can be encouraged from without, shall we say? I mean, obviously, you know, there is pushback from various places when it comes to business anyway, about how to approach this without alienating other audiences that are important to the brand. Now, regardless of whether that's a worthwhile point, and I don't think it is personally, it is nonetheless something that CEOs think about, marketing people think about. You know, just yesterday we had the Premier League here in the UK returning to the pitch with BLM on their shirts. You know, for a fusty old organization like Premier League, it was a fairly big deal. Inevitably, they've annoyed a huge swathe of essentially racist football fans.
Yep.
People who wouldn't think themselves racist, but you know, are very much part of that every life matters kind of sensibility. Now, that probably won't do a huge amount of damage to the Premier League, but they are because they are a huge established brand making massive amounts of money. You know, on the flip side, you've got Chick-fil-A today with their news, and you know, on the other side, and they don't care either. But there are brands that do worry about this stuff, not only because their audience may be not of the same opinion, but also because they don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to try and fail, I guess. So I suppose after that long spiel, my question is, you know, do you understand that fear? Is it a fear that's worth understanding? And if so, what can be done to sort of help from your perspective? Ernest, what do you think about this?
Well, I think that's part of the problem. Therein lies the problem. I think that if you recognize that you're doing the right thing, right? If we recognize that racism is a very disgusting stain in our human society, and that it is a human rights violation of some of the highest magnitudes. If we recognize that to be the problem, anything that is fighting and combating that should be the goal at the end of the day. I think when you are worried about ruffling feathers or alienating, who are you alienating in the fight against racism? And if it is racism, defending and protecting racists, which means that you're enabling and co-signing and endorsing subconsciously or unconsciously co-signing racists. And so I think that there's a time for companies to have to reflect on what is the audience and what is the audience that they want to, embrace. And if money means continuing the same bigotry and co-signing of a racist audience, then you are perpetuating the very problem that led us to this point in the first place. So companies have to, if they're really serious about this, they can't think about, well, what about the racist people that we support? Well, those are the people that's a part of the problem. And I think when I hear companies and people say that we don't want to alienate people, let's be pronounced. You don't want to alienate racists, which means that you are okay with profiting off of racists. And then your company is a problem. And so when riots happen, right, and people say, oh, don't burn down that building, or don't do this, don't do that, and people wonder, why are people invested, some protesters and anarchists and activists are interested in burning down the system, is because there are systems that are complicit with the violence, the bigotry, the white supremacy. And even though they don't put a KKK flag or a Confederate flag on their door, they are creating environments that protect and enable racists to persist. And so to me, there is a black and white to this. Either you are on the side of the oppressor, or you on the side of liberating people, regardless of color. And I think if you're someone who's considering or worried about the racists in your business, then you still don't get it, and you're perpetuating the problem.
Yeah, I actually can't think of any major company that has been boycotted because they were in support of diversity or against racism and has suffered any really serious consequences. It's sort of like, it is it is something that they could do and have the power to do, but that they've been afraid to do for reasons that I don't think balance sheets support. I think a lot of it has to do with inertia. Like if NASCAR can give up the Confederate flag and still think they're going to have an audience, I don't know what anyone else would be afraid of. And a lot of it is just fear of disrupting the status quo. And that's great when the status quo works for you, but you can't say that and then also say, we stand with you in solidarity in these trying times, because you don't. Yeah.
So following on from that, in terms of something you just mentioned there, Ernest, about, it doesn't have to be overt, for you to, the racism that we're talking about doesn't have to involve KKK, flags and whatever, or Confederate flags. I'm interested from a media perspective, because certainly here in the UK, we have a media where subtle racism is quite pervasive and it's coded, and you have to look out for it. If most people can see it, but there are a lot of people for whom it gets folded into a general sense of jingoism or nationalism, or even just a sense of classism. We're very good here at folding racism into classism. I don't know how much that's true in the US. I mean, clearly there are the same sort of, clearly you have your Breitbarts and you have your, overt right wingers, but I guess the question I wanted to ask is when you have a movement like that, when you have a moment like this where, there is a clear sort of injustice that needs to be dealt with, how can that also, that energy help with this more subtle, underlying stuff that sometimes gets, just slips by, because it's, in some ways it's quite sophisticated, racism, but it's a coded way of still getting that sort of message across. I guess, Amber, from a media perspective, how do you feel about that?
Well, I'll say that is the preferred form of racism of most of New York City, and certainly the parts of Brooklyn that I have lived in. I think that in a larger sense, thinking about inclusivity and all the things that must include is a way that sometimes people kind of make an in run around that. Because then you're hitting on any kind of classism, you're hitting on any kind of elitism, even though your real target is, we know you're saying and doing or perpetuating wildly racist stuff. Like, for example, I'm not there now, but like 2 blocks away from this famous like bar restaurant that opened up in Crown Heights, traditionally Black and Jewish neighborhood, that had bullet holes, and they kept them up, and they were sort of like, this makes a street, and were serving like cocktails named after like murdered rappers and all kinds of shit. It's like that kind of thing that's like, we're just having fun, we know it's not racist, it's ironic. And a really easy way to have a conversation about that was to talk about, like, you are, 1, alienating the community in which you sit, and 2, making fun of something that is not to be made fun of, that is like not funny. There are real lives at stake. And sometimes in those conversations that are on the surface about class, and in the United States, kind of like race is a lens through which things like class are lived. Like you have that before you get to that. You can easily have conversations about in-group, out-group, and inclusion, and not alienating people, and that kind of gets to that matter. But I think the best thing to do quite often is to connect the dots between what people think they're saying about class, and point out that that's also something that you're saying about race, and be as explicit as possible, and kind of like rip off the mask, which people don't care for. And that leads to other difficult conversations, but I honestly think it's the only way around it. Otherwise, that cover will always be used and will always be there.
What do you
I
think?
think we should just call it out, regardless of of waiting. I mean, if you're a white person and you hear and see these things and you sense that there's something going on that's not right, call it out. And I think the fear is that people fear this level of dejection or being excluded. But the truth of the matter is that you also have to do some soul searching and ask yourself, are these the people that you want to be affiliated with? Brands are always about affiliations. What makes a brand is reputation affiliations. So when we say that a company or a brand is, has a racist history or a racist audience, that doesn't come out of the sky. It's based on the following that they embrace, the audience that they appeal to, and the people they market to. So if your company is invested in a predominantly white audience, then by default, it is racist. If it is feeding towards a male-centered audience, but claims to be for all, then it is invested in sexism. And so when people make these statements, it's a fact, and it's a fact based on the fear that you have. So it's really, when it comes to these conversations about racism and noticing it, you have to ask yourself as a white person or someone in a position of privilege, you have to ask yourself, when I am silent, what am I co-signing? Because silence is violence, but what am I co-signing? And what does that say about me? And what does that say about the people that I don't check? Because if they're saying this in front of you, you better believe that they're doing these things to other people. And that's how you get an Amy Cooper in Central Park calling the police. Because some of her white friends, which when I was reading the story about her in the New York Times, she's had a history of problems. And of course she does, because that kind of behavior don't just get birthed overnight. Racists don't wake up accidental. There's no such thing, according to LL Cool J and his friends. Accidental racists don't exist. This is stuff that has happened and perpetuated because someone did never sit them down and check them. And a lot of times they're not hanging out with Black people and they don't have Black friends that are going to be like, yo, that's racist. But for the white, well-meaning white people that say they mean well, it is up to you and it's your responsibility to get your white family members and white friends together and tell them and me to stop it before it becomes an Amy Cooper situation, before it becomes a George Floyd situation, or a Karen situation, or someone calling the cops. That's how things escalate, and that's part of the problem.
In terms of the current sort of protests, are you hopeful that this energy can be sustained? And if you aren't, do you think there are things that the people listening, the brands that we talk to, the brands that we have the ear of, the businesses that we have the ear of, can do to ensure that this moment sustains itself and isn't usurped by the election in November or whatever other crazy stuff that's going to happen in this craziest of years? Because I mean, it clearly it's happened many times before, and this does feel like a special moment. But I certainly don't know if hope is the right reaction to be having right now. Well, how do you feel about that?
I am old enough to be skeptical and to need to be skeptical, but I want to be proven wrong. Like, it's heartening to see the wide range of people in the streets, the sustained protests, the protests in places large and small. Right now I'm based in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I've been kind of going back and forth to Brooklyn. Huge protests here in a small town in Pennsylvania to shut down the streets. People still going out, every day, and organizing, and people learning about organizing. That has been incredible, because that has implications not just for the now, but for reacting and preparing and getting communities together for what could come. I'm definitely excited to see policy change and policy proposals coming out of this, and to still see, while there have been policy announcements, the protests continue, because there is kind of that sustained need for presence. When it comes to what brands can do, I give money, keep giving money to the people who know what to do with it. Keep giving money, think about your messaging and what it is supporting, what it is and is not saying, but really it's kind of a put up or shut up moment, and ideally put up and mainly shut up for most brands. But give the money to the people that actually know what to do with it, and get out of the way as much as possible. Like, don't turn every activity that you do into a commercial for you, where you're patting yourself on the back for 75% of the dollars, and then the other 25% goes to whatever cause. That would be my only somewhat cynical advice, though I am hopeful, but
Yes.
cynical.
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic personally. I'm only 28, but I think for me, again, it's one of those things where I've, have ever since I've been in college. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I remember 2012. It was Trayvon Martin, and I was out there protesting in college and covering and talking to people, and I was 20, 21 around that time, and it was just like I felt like, oh, things are going to change. People are really outraged, and then that wave went away, and here we are 8 years later. And there's another person after several countless people. And to me, I think, what I would just hope for is that now we can start the real conversations, which should have been started, but we can really move past the surface level. Because what was frustrating about 2012 and 2014 and the years since was that there was always this calculated, almost like you were negotiating and debating. And everyone was treating it like a both sides issue. And that was always annoying. I never understood that. And I wasn't also in the position, as someone who was younger, to argue with the contemporaries of the time who always treat this like a debate on race, both sides. It's like, well, why is there both sides on racism? There's no both sides. And if there are both sides, it's the right side and the wrong side. There's no nuance there. But there was an obsession with, over the years, embracing and listening to white supremacists share their experiences and their perspective on why they are the way they are. And we were spoon-fed lies in the media and in the press about, why did people vote for Trump? And it's not about racism. It's like, no, it is about racism. It's just not overt as some people might feel, but there is racism that drove people to vote. There was anti-Blackness that drove people to make those votes. And when you're looking at the issue at Brexit in, the UK, it's the same thing. People were driven, racism was a part of the ballot. People were driven in making the decisions they made by racism. Whether they want to admit it or not, we cannot ignore that. And I think there were two waves, 2012, it's always an election year, 2012, 2016, and now 2020. So we have seen in 4 cycles in our recent history, these reckonings and conversations around race. And I feel like every 4 years we get a little bit better. And I think 2020 is the year where we're in a new decade where we have to move past both sides. We have to move past being neutral. We have to call a thing. And we really have to begin to punish and really crucify companies, brands, and individuals who are in the way. We have to do it. We can't do you can coexist. We have to call it out. We have to remove it because it is a tumor in this great human society that is trying to lean towards progress. I think white supremacy is a cancer, it's a tumor, and anyone who's supporting it is a part of that problem and not the solution. And in 2020, we can no longer coexist with racists. They're killing us. We can no longer coexist with white supremacy. We can no longer have a both sides situation. We're done with that. We did that in 2012. We tried to do the share the beer with the racists. We tried to do the table talks. We tried to do the dinners and the family debates. We're past that. I mean, Black people weren't doing that, but we as a society have to stop doing that. So that has to go immediately. And in 2020, I am cautiously optimistic that the media would do a better job and not, fanning the flames and creating this non-nuanced situation. There's no nuance to racism. Racism is racism, and it has to go away.
Well, Amber, Ernest, thank you so much for joining me. It's a privilege to hear you guys talk about this. And I hope everyone listening take those words to heart. Thank you for listening and watching, and please join us next time for more Future Thinking from Stylus.